Behind the Headlines. We're going to record this, as you've all heard. We send out a link, which I hope that after the presentation, when we make the link available, you will share with anyone you think will be interested in the content of this or other Behind the Headlines webinars. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening, and I hope that this conversation, that it will be, first of all, a conversation, and second of all, that you will find it enlightening and food for thought, at least. I don't expect everyone who watches these webinars to agree with everything, but I believe that for those of you who aren't familiar with Regavim, and I'll try to familiarize you with what we do and how we do it very briefly in a moment, but I believe that our position gives us some perspective on some of the issues that we'd like to share, and I think it puts us in a position to understand what's happening behind the headlines in a very particular way. So without further ado, I'm going to try to give a very, very brief introduction to Regavim before we go on to our to the content of this evening's conversation. And I'd like to share the screen so that you can, I hope you are seeing this. Yes. I'm not sure if you are seeing this correctly, but if you are, you should be seeing good. Yes. Okay, so Regavim was founded 17 years ago. We are dedicated to protecting Israel's resources. As an expression of sovereignty, we focus mostly, but not exclusively, on land resources, being the most basic and the most necessary, the most crucial of all of our resources, and really the most basic expression of who's in charge, the person who gets to decide who uses that most basic resource, for what purposes, and under whose authority is essentially what makes a sovereign nation. So we begin everything that we do from the ground up. We send out field coordinators throughout the country and examine what's actually happening on the ground. Then we take a step back and we connect the dots, and we see exactly what patterns emerge, what picture emerges, what policy either emerges or doesn't emerge, and then we address all of those issues. What is actually happening, what should be happening, who should be in charge of making it happen, and how. So we present our findings both to the public at large, and you'll see here just a few of the covers of some of our reports. All of our reports, all of our materials are available on our website. At the end of this presentation, there will be links, addresses, but we're very, very easy to find. We also have very, very active social media platforms, Facebook, even TikTok, Twitter. We're on all of these things, on Telegram as well. We send out updates whenever we have them. And we encourage people to join also our social media discussion groups so that you can ask questions, offer insights, and address the issues along with us. So tonight's conversation is going to essentially have two topics. The first, and I'll repeat the title for this evening's webinar, is a very famous, I believe it's an American expression. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And essentially what we're trying to dig down to this evening is, what have we learned or should we learn from the current situation, from the war that we are fighting now? And where do we go from here once we've learned those lessons? So we're going to try to pick apart some of the things that may be obvious to some, should be obvious to all, They are actually obvious to us in various levels of subtlety, but all of these lessons have serious ramifications for the next stage, the next stage of the war itself, the next stage after the war, and the next stage in the development of the state of Israel. So we're going to dive right in and look at lesson number 1. The first lesson, I think, it's something that I've been saying for a very, very long time, and that is the state of Israel is perhaps the greatest, has the most talent in the world of any people I've ever met of negotiating with ourselves. We've been negotiating with ourselves for many, many years, and we have to stop negotiating with ourselves. At present, there is no partner on the other side that is interested in making peace with us. There is no one on the other side that is actually interested in the negotiation that we've been carrying on with ourselves. And that's become abundantly clear, painfully clear, since October 7th. But for some of us, it was quite clear before that. Many of the materials that we've been putting out since the war broke out simply bring into clearer focus exactly who it is that we're trying to convince ourselves that we've been negotiating with. So I will show you some of them, and you can judge for yourselves. Sorry. I think I've messed around with the slides. I apologize. That was a big mistake. This is the one we were seeing. Okay, we're going to try that again. It's very brief. So that's just some small examples of some of the things that have been suggested in the past. And all of them essentially suffer from the same basic misconceptions. The things that we have tried to convince ourselves that the other side is interested in the same things that we are. And we have found, unfortunately, that that is simply not the case. For those of you who aren't familiar, the face on your screen right now is the president of the Palestinian Authority, Ashtaya, and this was taken from the official Palestinian Authority page yesterday, or perhaps the day before. The quote in Arabic says, and this is not words we're putting into his mouth, this is words that he said. It's an announcement, essentially a message to the President of the United States and to Israel. I'll translate it for you, for those of you who don't understand Arabic. What he says is, the reconstituted authority that Israel and its allies seek is not us. That is not the Palestinian Authority. We are a patriotic authority fighting for the fulfillment and realization of full independence and the end of all occupation. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but it has become extremely clear from all the statements in from the Palestinian Authority in recent weeks that they consider occupation not only what's happened since 1967, but everything that happened since 1948. So occupation in this context means all of the state of Israel. And this becomes clear when you read more and more of these statements. We have a whole collection of them on our website. I will show you a very short combination of clips in a moment. These are some of the statements. I've shown them before. We have more and more of them every day. Statements made by top Palestinian officials about the events of October 7th. They leave very, very little room for confusion about the difference between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas.
العالم الذي يريد أن يرى اليوم الآخر، احنا بنعرف تماما انه حماس مركب رئيسي في المشهد السياسي الفلسطيني. بالتالي وجودنا الوطنيه هي مرتكز في حركه فتح بالحكومه السيد الرئيس توجيهاته ان نعطي كل اهميه للوحده الوطنيه الفلسطينيه.
So lesson number one, as I've said, is that we have to stop negotiating with ourselves. And we have to come to grips with the idea that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas share the same goals, and neither one is a relevant partner at this time. And no other partner has emerged in the 30 years since we've been trying to negotiate a resolution. We have to set that aside, and it is our firm belief that it will take 50 years of absolute quiet and a complete restructuring of the representation of the Palestinian people for us to even begin to consider putting any Palestinian leadership in charge in any way. At the moment, there is certainly, the Prime Minister of Israel has made very, very clear statements about Hamas and about the Palestinian Authority, both being illegitimate options for leadership or power of any kind in the Gaza Strip. And of course, the next question that we'd have to ask is, if the Palestinian Authority is an illegitimate partner in Gaza, what makes anyone think they're a legitimate partner in Judea and Samaria? They certainly are not. So we're going to have to re-examine the basic principles upon which we have been operating for many, many years. We have some very clear ideas about what should replace those collapsed paradigms, which we'll get to at the end of this presentation. But we want to go next to the next lesson that should have been learned, or we should be learning from previous encounters, and certainly from this one. Lesson number two, negotiating with terrorists simply encourages terrorism. Hostage deals are killing us, and they have been killing us every day since 1985. And it has become more or less a joke, that mantra that we used to hear all the time. It has been the long-standing policy of this government not to negotiate with terrorists. I don't know how many of you who are watching are old enough to remember. I remember hearing that mantra repeated over and over again. And that simply gave way in 1985 with the Jibril exchange. I won't call it prisoner exchange, but there was a deal made in 1985, the first of its kind, was followed afterwards, subsequently, by several other deals, all of which had the same results. This is just a table that dates back to 2012, comparing two of these very, very large deals, but they weren't the only ones. Thousands of terrorists were released in order to reclaim either live or deceased Israeli soldiers who and one civilian who were taken hostage. And here is some of the results of those deals. After the Jibril deal in 1985, the first of its kind, within 3 years, over almost 240 terrorists made their way back into Judea and Samaria, even though they were banned from coming back in. And 48% of the terrorists that had been released by that time, within that 3-year time frame, returned to terrorism and were eventually, some of them were killed in battle, and some of them were rearrested. But the head of Hamas at the time announced that almost 570 civilians within that Israelis within that 3-year period, and that's not talking about the soldiers who risked their lives and sometimes lost their lives to recapture these terrorists, but 569 Israeli civilians were killed by these released terrorists in those 3 years. What happened after the 3rd year? The first Intifada broke out. And the first Intifada was actually masterminded by and carried out by the very same terrorists who were released in the Jibril deal. The thousands of terrorists that were freed between 1993 and 1999 essentially were the creators and executors of the second Intifada. And you know how many lives, Israeli lives, were lost in the second Intifada, with all of the exploding buses and all of the pizzerias and all of the knifing, stabbings, murders of all kinds. So these very same people, and Israel knew very well that they were terrorists and had not been rehabilitated in any way. They were simply let back on the streets and left to carry out, to try again and succeed, unfortunately. The dozens of terrorists that were released in the Tannenbaum deal in 2004 also murdered more innocent Israeli civilians. And we know that the terrorists who were released in the Shalit deal, among them Yahya Sinwar, who is the mastermind and the chief of the commander of this current war, of the attack on Simchat Torah that has cost 1,400 lives at the time, and soldiers who are fighting this war. He was released in this deal as well, along with all of the top commanders who are carrying out the war against us right now. So the war that Israel is now waging is a fight to destroy the very same terror monster that we created by capitulating to these terrorists' demands. We let these terrorists, we captured them, we risked soldiers' lives to capture them, we incarcerated them, and then we let them go in order to liberate Israelis, soldiers who were taken hostage by Hamas, and they have become emboldened. And they know very, very well we've created the precedent ourselves, and we can no longer say that we don't negotiate with terrorists. We most certainly do, and we do it very poorly. They know very well the value that we place on human life. So that's lesson number 2. Dealing with terrorists, negotiating with terrorists is a recipe for more terrorism. In much the same way, territorial withdrawal is a recipe for disaster as well. And we have seen this over and over again. As a matter of fact, I have to tell you that about 10 days ago, I was on a field tour with a foreign journalist, and he asked me a very strange question. He said, well, why do you think it is that there are certain areas that are the epicenters of terrorism? You know, you have Jenin and the Lion's Den terrorist group, and you have the places in Gaza, and you have, we have problems in very specific places. And I said, well, look at the map of where Israel was and where it withdrew from. The vacuum that was left behind was the incubator for all of this terrorism. And it is not a secret, and it is very, very well known. All of the places where we were and we now are not are the places from which the massive terrorism is launched. This, just to jog everyone's memory, this is a map of the communities in Gush Katif. And I would just point out that these are the places that are in the news now. These are all the Jewish communities that were demolished by the state of Israel in the disengagement, quote unquote. And you'll see all the famous names that are here now. Here's Khan Yunis, where we're fighting right now, and Jabalia, and this is Gaza City. And all of these places were are the places where there was the greatest concentration of Jewish presence until the disengagement. And those are the places, and the northern Samaria communities that were demolished, the things that took their place are the Lion's Den and the massive terrorism coming out of Jenin and Nablus right now. So all the places where Israel is fighting are the places where it once fought, once controlled, and unilaterally withdrew, including the security zone on our northern border with Lebanon. So lesson number 3, territorial withdrawal is a recipe for violence, for terrorism, and for further loss of control. Lesson number 4, what have we learned? Again, a corollary. Nature abhors a vacuum. That's what we've seen in the Gaza Strip. That's what we saw in the northern security zone, our border with Lebanon and Syria, and in the northern Shomron. And it is also true throughout Judea and Samaria. This is what Regavim was created to address inside Israel and inside Judea and Samaria. When there is a vacuum of law enforcement, when the state of Israel does not actively exercise its jurisdiction, its sovereignty, its authority, that vacuum is filled immediately by terrorism. And this is a lesson that is very, very frightening, because we will have a look at a moment at the map of the current state of this vacuum within Israel and within Judea and Samaria. But I want to move on from here to the corollary lesson, and that is lesson number 5, that the results of the October 7th attack will pale in comparison to what will happen if we allow it to, along this, inside this vacuum that we have allowed to exist in Judea and Samaria. So we're going to look at this much more closely. We discussed this in our previous webinar at length. This is the same map that I presented 1 month ago, but we now understand the lesson of this a lot more clearly. And that is that there are nearly 19,000 illegal structures that are filling up the security buffer zone all along what was known as the Green Line. It's not precisely there, but all along that empty space that was supposed to be the buffer between Judea and Samaria and Little Israel, the major population centers of Israel. And if you can see them in this resolution, if you can't, I suggest you go on our website for a closer look. But these are all, understand what the range is here, right? From these illegal structures right here, all of this, you have a distance of a few miles, and I'm talking about single digits, to all of the major population centers in Israel. 80% of Israel's population lives within range, almost literally stone's throw away from all these illegal structures. And the Palestinian Authority has stated unequivocally, clearly, loudly, that these are not here by accident, they're strategically placed, and that they fully expect a repeat of October 7th to be launched on Israel from here. They are training their Palestinian quote unquote police, which is an army for all intents and purposes in everything but name. They are training them to do the exact same types of activities in this direction as the Hamas fighters were training to do in this direction. So we have footage and statements about the military training that they are receiving, training that involves overtaking Jewish communities, hostage taking, and more. And all of this is enabled by these having essentially annexed the buffer zone. The vacuum of law enforcement that has allowed 20,000 illegal structures to be built here is an existential threat to the state of Israel. That is a lesson that is beginning to sink in finally with Israeli legislators and with the IDF, but not completely. We actually have footage of a massive army drill that was carried out in the last week or so, about 10 days ago, where they are drilling soldiers for all sorts of scenarios in Israel. But the scenarios all were based on the idea that the Palestinian police force would be on our side and help us to push back an onslaught of terrorism coming from Judea and Samaria. This is not only misguided, it is insane. And the army itself knows that, and the instructions were the opposite. But of course, you have a paradigm, and they have not replaced this paradigm yet. So we're working very, very hard on creating new paradigms so that we can help jolt the security apparatus and the government apparatus in the state of Israel out of this sort of reverie where we have convinced ourselves that we have a partner on the other side that is interested in quelling terrorism, excuse me, rather than encouraging it. We're working now very, very closely with members of the government. More on that in the second half of this presentation when we talk about how we go, where we go from here. The next lesson is this, and it arises from that map and others. Lesson number 6. For at least 4 decades, Israeli governments, all Israeli governments, all of them without exception, have simply kicked the can down the road. They have put off making those tough decisions and facing those harsh realities. And those harsh realities have now come home to roost. I met with a reporter yesterday, fascinating thing. A reporter from Japan. They have no interest in this conflict whatsoever. They have a very particular way of seeing the world. And he said to me, well, you know, who's going to be held responsible? And what's going to happen after the war and the next round of elections? Will it be more right wing? Will it be more left wing? And I said, here's your problem. You haven't learned the lesson either. All of those labels no longer mean anything. Our basic paradigms have to be redrawn completely because every single government for the past 40 years has ignored or has based all of their assumptions on simple things that are simply fantasy. And those fantasies have burst. Those fantasies have come crashing down. The fantasy is that because we want to live in peace and we want to live in prosperity and we want to live somehow or other without conflict, and we are able to accept minorities and others within our midst, as long as they abide by the law, we assume that the other side wants those things as well. And we have learned very, very painfully in recent months that that is simply not the case, that they would rather die and bring destruction to themselves as long as they can bring the same to us. So we have to realign all of those basic notions that we were operating on for 40 years. And it's very painful, and it's going to be a long process. More on that as we move along. Final lesson. Final lesson. Again, a corollary. Our enemies have been playing the long game, and we have been willing to take short-term steps, lull ourselves into a false sense of security in order to get some peace and quiet. They have not. The basic underlying principles over the last many years, I would say at least 20 years, have been that if we ensure economic prosperity for the Palestinians and for the people living in Gaza, whoever they may be, we will buy ourselves peace and quiet, because everyone wants to live in prosperity. Everyone wants a better life for their children. Well, they have been fooling us, playing the long game. All the indications are that the Hamas leadership was handing over crumbs to the Israeli military, handing over members of the Islamic Jihad or other small fish in order to lull the government of Israel into a false sense that they were actually partnering with us for a better, or at least for the time being. We have been duped by our own wishful thinking, and that has come to an end at this point. The government of Israel can no longer trade off temporary quiet for and sell essentially long-term goals. And the government is going to have to express a vision for moving forward. Now, so all of that leaves us with, where does Regavim fit in here? What do we recommend? How do we move forward, all of us? And how do we at Regavim help to move all of us forward with our particular skills and our particular vision? So the concrete steps that Israel needs to take to ensure that October 7th doesn't happen again are numerous. Some of the things I'm going to actually try to, I made a list here, a very careful list. I'm going to try to, hold on. That's not working. I'm not sure what you see, but I think we will stop the share. And now I'm going to try to give you some idea of how we think we should move forward. So the very first thing that the state of Israel has to do is not only to say, but to actually do what any government should do, and that is to enforce the law. It's a very, very simple concept that you'd be surprised about how radical it actually is. The state of Israel has at its disposal, and always has had at its disposal, tools that it does not use that could have combated much of this and should be combating much of what could happen in the future. And I mean zero tolerance for illegal construction in the Arab sector. I mean zero tolerance for funding by foreign concerns of illegal activity in areas under Israeli jurisdiction. I mean zero tolerance for foreign actors who come to this country under false pretenses in order to foment confrontation with IDF forces. All of these things exist in the law. Israel has been, let's say, hesitant, I would say cowardly, in terms of actually enforcing, using those tools, using the tools it has at its disposal under the law because of international pressure. But at this point, you know, there's a very famous Israelism that you have to, it's based on one of these old Yiddish stories that you had to eat the rotten fish and you got run out of town anyway. At this point, the state of Israel is being pilloried in international fora, being accused of all sorts of heinous crimes The President of the United States actually said Israel is bombing indiscriminately and has to change its attitudes towards civilian casualties, has threatened to deny visas to Israelis under any pretense that it feels is appropriate. All of these things are happening anyway, even though Israel has gone to extraordinary lengths, unheard of lengths, unprecedented and unequaled in the history of warfare to avoid civilian casualties. We're still being pilloried. And the same will be true when Israel actually is the one to uphold international law, to uphold the Oslo Accords, which constitute international law, and to protect its sovereignty and its citizens. But it has to be done anyway. So it's going to be a situation in which Israel is going to need all the friends it can get, and is going to have very, very few. But all of those tools actually exist in the law. And the very first thing that the state of Israel needs to do is to state clearly and then actually go ahead and enforce the law in areas under its jurisdiction. Even now, even during the war, zero tolerance policy for illegal activity. That will possibly open up a diplomatic front, but it's going to open anyway. That's our position. Number two is, and there have been steps, and we hope that this will continue to be the case, to halt all funding to the Palestinian Authority until all payments to terrorists are suspended. We have to not only halt our own funding and our own transfer of the tax money that we collect for them, we have to also intercept all payments that are made from foreign sources to the Palestinian Authority until all of the basic criteria are met by the Palestinian Authority, all the things that they themselves committed to from day one. And that means no more payments to terrorists. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the day after the October 7th massacre, the Palestinian Authority announced that it would be paying any of the Hamas terrorists who were captured and put in Israeli prisons, or the families of all Hamas terrorists involved in the October 7th massacre who were killed in action. And that continues to be the case. So we are essentially paying them to kill us. And we are allowing the United States government to pay them to kill us. We are allowing the European Union and the European countries and governments and all sorts of private church organizations and private pro-Palestinian organizations to pay them to kill us. That has to stop. By law, the Palestinian Authority is not entitled to anything so long as they continue to support terrorism. And the Palestinian Authority has no right to exist, has absolutely no justification for its existence, so long as there is incitement in the curriculum, so long as the Palestinian Charter has not been amended, and so long as they continue to encourage, support, glorify, and call for terrorism. So it's going to be painful. We're going to have a lot of pushback, but we have no choice. We cannot allow this. We cannot make believe that it's not happening, because it's happening. It has always been happening, and we have to make sure that it stops. So that's number two. The second question is, what policy changes are necessary in the aftermath of October 7th? How do we make sure that Israel makes the right choices? Here's where Regavim's very particular position comes into play. We have impacted policy in the past, and we continue to impact policy moving forward. Our materials focusing on the issues that we have identified on the ground are being presented to legislators. We're working very, very closely with members of Knesset, with members of the cabinet, actually, to address the restructuring of Israeli policy now that all of the paradigms have fallen through. Because honestly, there's a black hole. all of the assumptions have to be re-examined. And we have been working on replacing those assumptions for 17 years. So there's suddenly much more interest in learning from the lessons that we have been trying to teach for many, many years. So we're hopeful that much of what we've been saying will actually have a much more receptive audience moving forward. It is clear that new policy in terms of the Palestinian Authority, in terms of its behavior over the past 30 years, and in terms of the changes it has effected on the ground since 1995 are necessary. And that is exactly where we are focusing in order to prevent the next massacre coming out of Judea and Samaria, which would make the massacre on the Gaza border look like chump change. So that's number 2. Number 3, applying Israeli sovereignty and managing the Palestinians. What options does Israel have? So we continue to call unashamedly for a clear statement by the government of Israel of Israeli rights in Judea and Samaria as a whole. That means areas A, B, and C. And to reiterate Israel's rights to those areas, but to extend Israeli sovereignty to Area C. In order to do that, the state of Israel has to take certain steps that are absolutely unavoidable. The first thing is to conduct a census of the population, the non-Jewish population of Area C. How many Arabs are really there? How many need to be there? How many are there legally? How many have been moved in there illegally by the Palestinian Authority? How many people are we dealing with? The second thing is to carry out a full land survey and registration of all the land in Area C, and to establish once and for all who owns what is state land, and to close the books on that, rather than renegotiating it all the time, and then as a result being forced to uproot legal Jewish communities, such as what happened in Amona, in Netiv Avot, and in other places, simply because there was no final land survey and registry. When those two things are accomplished, the state of Israel will be able to move towards reestablishing its sovereignty by law in Area C. But in order to do that, we have to deal with the Palestinian refugee issue. Step number 1, and that I think is clear to everyone, particularly after October 7th, is that UNRWA, the UN agency that deals exclusively with the Palestinian Authority, with the Palestinian refugees, has to be disbanded. It is part of the problem, a major part of the problem, and not part of the solution. The refugees should be treated according to the criteria and in the framework that treats refugees from every other conflict in the world. I've written on this rather extensively, and I invite you all to look it up, read this article, and educate yourselves about how American money is going to UNRWA, which is not only maintaining but actually expanding the refugee population and the refugee problem to the point where it is unsolvable. When UNRWA was first created, it was in charge of the lives of 750,000 people. The criteria for refugee status was extremely unusual, let's put it that way. Anyone who had been in the state of Israel for 2 years, even if they had citizenship elsewhere, meaning an Egyptian who came to Palestine to work in 1946, was given refugee status. That 750,000 people was an insane and extremely large, broad category. And now it is closer to 6 million, because Palestinian refugees are the only population in the world that continue to be refugees 5 generations later, even when they have citizenship in another country, even when they are living in the exact same place that their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents lived, All of these things are anomalies, and they were created specifically to eradicate the state of Israel. UNRWA must be disbanded before Israel can move on to the next phase, establish sovereignty and solve the conflict, at least in Area C. In terms of the rest of it, the international community must be forced to give full citizenship to the quote unquote refugees living in their territories. That includes Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. All of them have kept, for 75 years, have kept Palestinian quote unquote refugees as stateless people. And this is illegal under international law. I would also recommend that you look into the fact that the Jordanians rescinded the citizenship of all of the Palestinian refugees of the West Bank in 1988. This is a complete violation of the Geneva Conventions and international law, and no one said a word. The international community has an obligation to require the Arab countries to uphold the law, to obey the law, and to solve this problem for these people so that the conflict can be resolved. All of those things are steps that the state of Israel can and should be taking within the law. We have developed very, very carefully and detailed policy papers on all of these issues. And we are working with the government to try to get the right people to take up each one of these large tasks that have been ignored for far too long. But in all of these cases, there are steps along the way to Israel taking control of its destiny, behaving like a grown-up sovereign country, and not just reacting to the changing tides around it that have never changed in our favor. I think this is the events of October 7th and thereafter are, you can't even call them a wake-up call anymore. They are a sea change. They are, in Israel, people are referring to this war as the second war of independence. There's a lot to be said for that. It is actually an extremely appropriate name. We at Regavim call this the disengagement war because we are fighting now to reverse the disastrous consequences of the misguided unilateral disengagement from all the places where the terrorism is emanating now, as we saw in the beginning. But all of these things are doable. They're all possible. They're all things that we have been planning and working towards for 17 years since Regavim was founded, and we're working even harder now. And I encourage all of you to join us in working towards them. There are a lot of ways that every single person who's here this evening can help to fight and to win. The very first thing is to share our policy papers and our information and our data with anyone that you can. Encourage people to listen to the webinars or to, even better, to read our reports, to follow us on all of our various platforms, to be informed, and also to support what we do by donating. This is an opportune moment. It's almost the end of the Gregorian year, and people who are looking for a great way to get a tax exemption before the end of the year, I think we're it. So anyone who can help us to fight another day, that is greatly appreciated. I believe that in the chat, we're going to put in donation details. I'm going to try to look at the chat now and see if there are specific questions. But in general, yes, let's see. Who's this? Okay, there's a lot of yeah. So I'm hoping that John, if you hear me, if you could put up donation details, or I will once again share the screen. I can do that. And yes, here we are. I have here on the screen, hopefully somewhere here. Yes. There we are. This one. If you're seeing that, you can pull out your phone and scan one of those things, and it will take you to our website's donation page or to our JGive donation page, or you can go follow us on any of those links that are listed at the bottom, or contact me directly. I'm always happy when people send me specific questions or feedback in general. We try to incorporate your questions either in the following webinar or in materials that we put up on our various discussion groups. I encourage anyone who needs more material, more information, to simply contact me by email. I'm really easy to find. My email is Naomi, Naomi, @regavim.org. So I'm always available and welcome your questions, comments, and input. With that, I'm going to sign off with just, I hope that you'll all forgive me for adding in that we're all praying for the safety of all of our soldiers and all of our civilians. There is very, very little difference between them in this country. I don't know of any family that is not directly involved, impacted, and we are living in a very, very difficult situation here. But the atmosphere in Israel, aside from being one of anxiety, is one of tremendous determination. I don't think there's a single person in Israel who isn't aware of the massive historic moment that we are at right now. And I believe, aside from the tremendous outpouring of trying to heal the rifts in Israeli society, we all understand that we're going to have to rebuild our political structures and everything else, really, all of those paradigms from the ground up. But it all has to be based on one very simple concept, and that is we are living in a moment of tremendous importance in terms of Jewish history and Jewish destiny. And we invite all of you to step up and be a part of that, help impact and make that Jewish history and Jewish destiny take a positive turn from all of this destruction, from all of the horror that we've experienced in the past couple of months. We have to turn it into something constructive. We at Regavim try very, very hard all the time to, rather than simply complain about the problems, to craft solutions, to offer answers. And I hope that you'll all join us in looking forward, looking ahead, and trying to build positively on this moment. I see a question here, a very interesting question about several questions. First of all, plans to convict and punish Hamas terrorists. That is actually being debated at the moment in the Knesset. There have been several legislative proposals. Perhaps in the next webinar, which will be hopefully in 4 weeks, God willing, we'll be able to have an answer to that question, but it's being thrashed out right now in Israel. There are laws on the books that allow perpetrators of genocide to be punished according to a very different standard. And that is, it's altogether likely that that is what is going to be applied to the Hamas terrorists who are engaged in this massacre. Another question that was raised here, will it be possible, along with dismantling UNRWA, to rescind essentially the refugee status of the Arabs? Absolutely, that is a requirement. And in the vast majority of cases, again, of the 750,000 original refugees that were placed under UNRWA's care, that was 75 years ago, not all of them are still alive. And a very large proportion of them have alternative citizenship. They are not refugees under any other standard. In addition, the second and third and fourth and now even fifth generation of those quote unquote refugees are not refugees by any other standard either. So if you actually bring the standards by which refugeeism is applied to the Palestinian population in line with that, with the same standards applied to every other population on the planet, you will solve over 80% of the problem with the stroke of a pen. That's number one. And the rest of them, the other 20%, there are solutions. And those solutions have to be imposed by the international community and the Arab nations involved and not involved have to be forced to step up and take responsibility for the situation that they have helped to create. The possibility of the government taking steps to reclaim Gaza. I don't see that that's going to happen. The government of Israel has said that it will maintain responsibility for security in Gaza. And that is a very good start. Who will be allowed to live there? Who would want to live there? Here's the thing. We don't want to put the cart in front of the horse. If you solve the refugee issue, you give the people living in Gaza the option of citizenship and emigration. 90% of them will leave and go elsewhere. They have said so. They continue to say so. The Palestinian leadership knows that. And so do the Jordanians who rescinded their citizenship and the Egyptians who rescinded their citizenship. They know very well that the people who are being held in Gaza as pawns don't want to be there. They want to be anywhere else. And if the international community actually does step in and step up, and UNRWA is disbanded, and citizenship is offered to them or imposed, then you'll solve almost the entire problem. There'll be a very small minority of people who will still have to have their status dealt with. So we're going to leave it at that for this evening. Our time is up, unfortunately. Again, I encourage you to write to me with specific questions. I'm happy to share whatever information that we have. I encourage you, as soon as we send out the link to this webinar, to share it with anyone you think would find it interesting. I appreciate feedback about the presentation this evening, previous webinars that we've had, or anything that you'd like to discuss in future webinars. Meanwhile, I hope you'll all join me in serious prayer that our soldiers and civilians remain safe, that they all return of sound mind and body to their homes and families, and that we come through this nightmare scenario stronger, smarter, and more unified, more determined to take our destiny in our own hands and to make our history, to move our history in a positive direction. Thank you all for joining me, and Bsorot Tovot, as we say. We should all hear good news soon.